Now for adding fullness, we are going to use the remaining skirt section of our dress block from Studio Faro, and we're going to look at adding fullness just to the hemline to begin with. So what we're going to do first is we're going to cut out that skirt section. So I've cut out the skirt section of the block, and for this demonstration of adding fullness, I'm going to do a flounce. So the first thing I have to determine is where I want my final hem to finish. So I'm going to have my hem finish halfway between the hip and the knee, so a mid-thigh length. So roll that in, ensuring that it is square. Square with the center front and the side seam. So that's where I want my hem to finish. Now I have to determine how big do I want my flounce. So for my flounce, I'm going to go halfway between the hip and my new hemline. Again, making sure it is square to your center front and your side seam. Draw that in. So now I know that this section here is going to become my flounce. This section here is the rest of my skirt. Now to create my flounce, I need to divide the flounce section into panels. Now, how many panels you do depends on how flouncy you want your finish to be. So for this one, I'm going to do 5 panels. So if you wanted it less flouncy, you could do 3 panels, or you could, I wouldn't do it any less than 3, or you might do 4. So when you roll these in, you want them to be approximately the same. But if there's small difference in the sizes, it's not too much of a problem. So you can see mine, there's actually a bit of a difference, but if you wanted to, you could divide up that section to get it perfect, but this should be fine. Then I'm going to name, I should say number my panels. And I'm just going to write CF here, so I know that number 1 is at the center front. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to cut that off. And then you can cut through each panel line almost all the way through, but you're just going to stop just before the line so it remains attached. Now you need a piece of paper to stick this onto. So I've got my piece of paper, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to glue these down so they have an equal amount of slashing and spreading between each panel, for example. So what I'll do, I'll glue that down and then I'll add my seam allowance. So that is my flounce that I've slashed and spread between each panel an even amount. Now before I can add my seam allowance, I need to just blend the bottom. So when you're blending, you're going to probably cut off some of the corners of your panels so you have a nice smooth curve. Oops, that one didn't quite stick. I'll just re-stick that number 5. Again, you can do that along the top as well because it's quite angular where the panels meet, but we want it to be ever so slightly curved. Now a couple points to remember here. Where it meets at the centre front, it has to be a right angle, and where it meets at the side seam, it should also be a right angle. So when it is cut and sewn, you don't have a triangular finish at your side seam or at your centre front. Okay, so that is my finished flounce. I've added my seam allowance all the way around except for the centre front, and I've added a centre front fold line because we're going to cut this on the fold so we get one big flounce to go on our centre front. Now you would repeat this process exactly with the back piece. So now we're going to do a gathered flounce, and we're going to do two different techniques which have different finishes depending on how much drape you want with your gathered flounce. So again, we have the skirt section of the dress block from Studio Faro, and we've cut that out, and we're going to mark in our hem and how big we want our flounce to be. So I'll do that now. So I've drawn in my hemline and my flounce line to show how big my flounce is going to be. Now the first technique is basically just measuring that size, so the width and the length of the flounce, and redrawing that so it is either 1.5 times the width or 2 times the width, depending how many gathered or how gathered you want it to look. So for this one, I'm going to do 2 times the width here, and I can draw that up separately on my piece of paper. So I'm just going to measure it. And for a begin, again, this is square to the centre front and to the side seam. So if I measure that, I have 3.4 centimetres by 1.2. So 3.4 times 2 is 6.8. So I'm going to draw up a rectangle that is 6.8 by 1.2. And that basically is creating a long strip that gets gathered to the bottom of the hem. Okay, so this is my pattern piece for my gathered flounce. I've added my seam allowance. It's twice the width of the original section, and it will get gathered onto that point there. I've added in a centre front fold line and notches. So when you do gather that on, you would have corresponding notches here, which you would meet. Actually, you don't need this one down here, just need the top one. Okay, so you would gather that section onto here, and you would match those notches so your gathers were evenly distributed. All right, so for the next one, we're going to again, so this is the second way you can do a gathered flounce. So this way is a lot drapier, and it has a lot more kick out to the sides, and it really depends on what you want your finished design to look like as to which technique you would use. So again, like with the first flounce, we're going to draw in 5 panels evenly. So I've got my 5 panels that I've numbered, and I've added in my centre front so I don't lose track of whereabouts that is. Now what you're going to do is you're going to cut these out individually. So you're going to cut them all the way through this time. Okay, so I've got my panels cut out now, and to make a gathered flounce, we're going to use a technique similar to this one, but we're going to have gaps between our slash and spread lines, and it's going to curve upwards in a circular direction. So you would place your pieces down, and you'd have your gap between 1 and 2, roughly the same width as the panel. Actually, I might move these down a little bit so I've got room. And this here, this width, should be the same as well. We try and keep it quite even. So this gathered flounce is going to have a lot more drape to it than the previous one. which is just basically a rectangle twice the width. So now I'm going to glue that down and add my seam allowance. So I've re-blended my curve line here around my panel pieces so it doesn't have that angular finish, and as you can see, some of the corners just get trimmed off so you have a nice curve that flows. I've added on my seam allowance, my center front fold line because it's going to be cut on the fold, and a notch that is halfway between that top seam, so when I attach it to my skirt I can match up this notch. So again, if you don't remember, that notch and this notch will be matched up and lined up so you have an even amount of gathers on each quarter of the skirt. Now you repeat this process for the back and do the exact same. Now I just want to go back up to the original gathered flounce we did. So this is a technique you could use if you were doing a tiered skirt or dress. So you would work out the width of whatever it was you were attaching that to, and you would times it by 1.5 or 2 and create a rectangle. Now if you were doing a second tier, you would work out what the width of this was, times that by 1.5 or 2, again depending on how many gathers you want, and you'd create a second rectangle. If you wanted a third tier, you would do the same. The second one, times that by 2 and create a third rectangle, which would be gathered, and each one is gathered onto the one above. The only problem with that technique and that style is you end up needing, because this is on a fold, a really long piece of material to be able to cut out that third tier.